Значит, и Полина скажет, когда можно начать.
Все, трансляция начинается.
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yes, please.
No. I think it'd be good if everybody muted themselves. Well, thank you very much. This is a great honor. It's the first time that I'm appearing to an audience in Russia, inside Russia. I have, of course, addressed people in World Sanskrit conferences and comparative philosophy conferences, of course, where there have been delegates from Russia. But this is the first time that my Akashvani is reaching Russia. And I hope that my English with a slight Australian accent will be easy to follow. So the topic that I chose to speak on is called Beyond Philology, Hermeneutical Principles, the ṣad-liṅga in the Mīmāṃsā and its philosophy of language, mantras and devatā. This is for the Institute of Philosophy, Russian Academy of Sciences and RUDN-University, Moscow. So where does this paper actually, in a way, or the discussion begins way back in Melbourne, in the city that I'm in at the moment, where the World Sanskrit Conference was held, which I had co-organized here in Melbourne, before the conference in Delhi, and after Vienna. And there was a panel there on Pandita tradition and the Western episteme. So it was really a discussion on philosophy vis-a-vis philology, or if you like, philology vis-a-vis philosophy. And at that panel were present Professor Johannes Broncroft, Robert and Sally Sutherland Goldmans, Stephen Phillips, Greg Bailey, and there was very heated discussion on this issue. So I have followed this through in a number of publications and in my research extensively. And this is the result of some years of work on this subject, which I hope you will find interesting. So at one time, philology, the Greek term love, word, reason, was the queen of the human sciences at the dawn of Western humanistic learning, encompassing the study of languages and text, early on of Greek and classical Latin or Roman literature, and the Bible as well, that led to the rise of modern humanities and the modern university. But what we know as modern classical philology, which is a combination of literary studies, history, and linguistics, and what I describe as textual archaeology, begins in the early Renaissance with Petrarch, 1304 to 1374, and it burgeons in German scholarship in the 16th century with the advent of comparative philology, which analyzes the relationship between languages and helps the process of analysis to expand to European languages, and by the late 17th to early 18th centuries began to be applied to non-European, but especially for our purposes, Indo-Iranian/Indo-European cultures and thought. This extension abetted a romanticization process already in place since Novalis and Herder. What philology is good at doing is that it helps establish the authenticity of literary texts and their original form, and with this, the determination of their meaning. It is a branch of language that deals with the structure, historical developments, and the relationship of language or languages. End quote. It is in its most sophisticated form, of course, it is textual philology that includes the study of text and their history, in a sense, including textual criticism. This branch was created in relation to the long traditions of biblical studies, in particular with the variation of manuscripts. It looks at the authorship, date, and provenance of the text to place it in its historical context and to produce critical editions of the text. So the kind of work that's been done with the critical edition of the Mahabharata, but there's no interpretation except in works that follow later on. However, critics point out that philology of text marks the beginning of the philology of cultures, and with textual translations spills gradually into nation translation. What the French Indologist Roman Schwab had called the Oriental Renaissance, before Edward Said turned Schwab's insights into Orientalism, and Bimal Motilal, the Oxford Indian philosopher, called it Indologism. What this means is, as Humboldt had observed, quote, the nation unifies the trans-individual context of the use of grammar and lexicon and defines the relation to other languages and language communities in multiple manners. So as the British Empire expands, English is used as a measure of degree of civilized locution of other nations, such that Lord Macaulay in his infamous 1834 minutes could declare that all the books in Sanskrit are not worth one classic work in English. And English itself, an infant language of an infant island nation barely 600 years old. Or scholars of Vedism in Europe and America could pronounce that the nations of Europe have nothing to learn from the childish babblings and bewildering speculations of Aryans, the Aryan bards, or in Egerton's words, the dry bones of Vedic ritual culture. They seriously strain our patience and our charity, end quote. Max Muller shared the same view, but later changed his impressions as he went deeper into the text, though more in respect of Vedanta than the Vedas as such. It was Edward Wintonich who said that we have to pay attention to the interpretation of the Indians, because they've gone deeper into their texts, even if we don't agree with all the interpretation. So there were a few voices that were on the side of traditional understanding, but most of the European scholarship put themselves above the Indian self-understanding. Now, this went in hand with the discovery of Indian philosophical texts from the end of the 18th century that stimulated comparative philology alongside comparative mythology and later comparative religion, but also comparative philosophy, which is something that I'm interested in the early 20th century. And while there's some overlap with philosophy and the history of ideas, their essential claims, methods, and ethos are different. And this has to be explained. So I've got comparative philology on one side and comparative religion in the middle and comparative philosophy on the far side. So what Edward Said pronounces in his more general theory on Orientalism, in some sense applies to Indology. Take the late 18th century as the very early defined starting point. Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it, and in short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. That's still Edward Said. He says, I have found it useful here to employ Michel Foucault's notion of a discourse to identify Orientalism. My contention is that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the enormously systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period, and now in our post-secular period, of course, the Orient of the Western imagination in the internet world. So Said goes on to say the great philological discoveries in comparative grammar made by William Jones, Franz Bob, Jacob Grimm, and others were originally indebted to the manuscripts brought from the East to Paris and London. Almost without exception, every Orientalist began his career as a philologist, and the revolution in philology that produced Bob Sassi, Bernhoff, and their students was a comparative science based on the premise that languages belong to families, of which the Indo-European and the Semitic are two traits. One, a newly found scientific self-consciousness based on the linguistic importance of the Orient to Europe, and two, a proclivity to divide, subdivide, and redivide its subject matter without ever changing its mind about the Orient as being always the same, unchanging, uniform, and radically peculiar object. Likewise, and connected to the agenda of Orientalism, the history of Sanskrit philology and comparative historical linguistics is fully integrated with German political and intellectual history, ranging from the Enlightenment to the Cold War eras. German ideology and its othering becomes a model of pan-European Indology. So philology had an enormous impact on the development of Indology. Indology could be called an extension of the discipline of philology. Textual evidence became the main source for the study of ancient Indian culture, and philology proved to be most powerful tool for the purpose of its exegesis. It allows scholars to debate issues of historiographical significance, utilizing textual evidence not available to native scholars, thus creating a power differential which counteracted the fact that it was the European scholar who was the most foreign to the material. Philology was the specific methodological apparatus through which the privileged Enlightenment values of positivism, objectivity, precision came to surmount other value positions. Because it focuses almost exclusively on the smallest possible units of language, usually phonemes and particles less than the size of a complete word, it has always involved a sort of microscopy antithetical to larger units of discourse, in a sense antithetical to the whole problem of meaning in general. Philology has been responsible for a certain hermeneutical barrenness in Indology, despite its contributions in the historiographical and linguistic areas. And so I've discussed the attempts to place Sanskrit philology into the context of German philology, elsewhere drawing on the historical accounts of scholarship produced by Benfi, Mayhofer, Bakker, Gerard, Schickel, and Windisch, Ulin, Lysenko, and also Halfas. And going back to philologists in the 1700s, Condillac, Reid, Mombodo, Renan, Michelet, Pointe, Rousseau, William Jones, Max Muller, Vico, Bob, Van Schlegel brothers, Schleicher, Schiller, Van Humboldt, Windishman, Novalis, Weber, Lord Macaulay, Colebrook, Renaud, Herder, Schelling, Scheller, Duperron, Hegel, and Schopenhauer. So we've studied all these people. I had a very wonderful colleague. He was Czech. His name was Robert Slonak. He had done his Sanskrit studies in Prague and then later in Oxford, and was teaching in Melbourne University. So he had multiple languages, European languages. He was able to help translate a lot of these authors that I'm speaking about. And some, at least 2 or 3 of them, I think it was Mayhofer, Halfas, they had also come to the World Sanskrit Conference. But I have criticisms of both philologists being studied and the scholars who have studied them, partly because of their own epistemic discourse in geographical locations. Now, language has been central to Indology in 3 ways. Language has been central to Indology in 3 ways. Firstly, as one of the driving forces behind the European interest in India, once the significance of Sanskrit as a primary Indo-European language had been recognized. Secondly, the philological study of language became the main paradigm for all other facets of Indology, such as the study of literature, religions, text, etc. Only recently have other methodologies which focus on larger patterns of discourse other than those deemed appropriate for philological purposes began to make an impact in the field. Thirdly, Sanskrit played a role in the growth of language science out of the roots of philology, namely linguistics, as developed in programmatic form by Ferdinand de Saussure in his General Discourse in Linguistics, in the French, of course. Linguistic science. As philology gave way to the now science of linguistics in the 20th century, Indologists took up the new tools of historical linguistics, structural linguistics, semantics, semiotics, without, however, moving far from the basic intellectual values associated with philology itself. The fact that Sanskrit played its part in the development of linguistics via the role of comparative Indo-European linguistics meant that Sanskritists and Indologists would always feel a close kinship with and attachment to linguistic-based methods of research. Like philological methods, these new methods tended to be better suited to description than in interpretation. The philological and linguistics methods, it must be said, were by no means restricted to the study of language itself. Rather, they were the main tools for those objects composed of language, which were the main source for knowledge of ancient Indian culture. Often these linguistic-based studies say surprisingly little about the meaning of the textual contents, revealing a characteristic tendency of the Indological scholars towards avoidance of the problem of significance. Even philosophers in the German tradition were not immune from the influence of philology, which informed the contents of their work to a large measure. Thus, as Michael Ullin points out, quote him, the philosophers have a natural tendency to identify the milieu where the philosophical tradition has developed with the entire humanity, and to regulate other cultures in a sort of sub-humanity. One can even notice under this relation a return, it's a French word, with Hegel and Marx, the discovery of other civilizations was an object of interest. End quote. In a paper I recently wrote on William Halfas, I complained that Halfas saw himself in the parampara of Hegel and other German philosophers, but he was at heart much more a philologist cum Indologist, and while he accomplished great work on Indian philosophical texts, he failed when it came to the deeper philosophical challenges posed within Indian philosophy and their unique insights. He seemed more concerned with reading Indian texts through Gadamerian hermeneutics. Nothing wrong with Gadamerian hermeneutics, but if you stop at that, then it then becomes part of the German literature. And asking, rather than asking why Indian philosophy, so he was interested in reading Indian texts through Gadamerian hermeneutics and asking why Indian philosophers do not engage with Western philosophers or take their questions more seriously, forgetting that some Indian philosophers are trained in both traditions, the West and East. In his conclusive remarks, unassumingly placed in the appendix, Halfas again points at Hegel as the Occidental thinker who articulated the superiority of Europe's philosophy over Indian thought, a viewpoint reiterated with some modifications by Husserl, the German phenomenologist. Halfas ends the discussion by referring to Heidegger, who saw in the global Europeanization, in quotes, Europeanization, the phenomenological context within which future communication between the Occident and Orient has to happen. Although reference is made to transcending Orient and Occident, alternative views emerging, for instance, in the recent writings of leading physicists and psychoanalysts of the West, who suggested to overcome the binary opposition of clarity of Greek autonomous thinking versus the fog mythic superstitions of the Orient, are discarded by Halfas as syndrome. Not quite sure what that term means, but I'm quoting Eva Dargay on this. So anyway, he did not think that binary was to be discarded. As Eva Dargay in her review of Halfas points out, thus the conservative thinking of the author, that's Halfas, leads to the conclusion that because of the Europeanization of Earth, quote, ancient Indian thought in its unassimilable, non-actualizable, yet intensely meaningful distance and otherness is not obsolete, end quote. Now, if that were true, then the meaninglessness of Indian thought serves the sole purpose of reaffirming the Occident as subject and cementing India in the role of the other in distant objectification, thus excluding it from the dynamic and lived context of human existence in all its cultural diversity. So it comes back to the original meaning of Europeanization of the Earth from Husserl, who really thought it was inevitable that the European subject will prevail over the Orient object, Chinese, Indian, Middle Eastern, and so on. So such thinking continues the marginalization of non-European civilizations, thereby increasing the already existing gap between the West and the rest of the world. This critique should, however, be developed a little further. Okay, excuse me. Now, Halfas edited a collection on Paul Harker's writing on Vedanta, which bears the title Philology and Confrontation, 1995. Halfas follows Harker in showing a certain bias towards the Indic tradition, such as the attempted inclusiveness of all worldviews as incomplete manifestation of one great truth of Advaita Vedanta. And they both lay the blame on Swami Vivekananda, an early exponent of the quintessential virtues of Vedanta in the English medium, that Haka had described with his own new coinage of Neo-Vedanta. But as critics of Haka have pointed out, this pejorative or simplistic judgment echoes certain neo-intellectual movements such as the New Zemanismus or New Hegelianism, or if you like, even Nazism, that were developing in Germany of Haka's time. But yet, Halfa's masterly exegetical study of Indian texts has provided a profound understanding of different traditions of India, from Vedanta to Vaisheshika to Mīmāṃsā, that stem from his commitment to non-Orientalized scholarship and what it means to delve deep into the tradition's self-understanding. He wrote one of the more accessible books on Adi Shankara of the Advaita Vedanta and Kumarila Bhatta of the Purva Mīmāṃsā fame, which not surprisingly contains one of the finest studies of the origins of the Brahmanic doctrine of karma, from the sacrificial ashes, as it were, of the Apurva, the unprecedented potentia theory of the ritualist Mīmāṃsakas. This study highlights the unique insights that Halfas has offered in his close reading of the rather difficult and often marginalized darshana of the Mīmāṃsā. For its apparent ritualistic excesses at the expense of much else of philosophical significance in the textual verse, as I will show, that has earned him timeless gratitude from traditional Pandita scholars who have yet to work through the Orientalist legacy bequeathed by colonial scholars in India and pay more attention to, quote, India and Europe, rather than India and Europe. Despite this legacy, and I believe with some justification, J.N. Mohanty, who was a close friend of Halfas, places Halfas in the interstices of Indology, Philology, and classical philosophy. So now this brings me to say that there is an aspect of human thought and culture that calls for interpretation, explanation, and delineation in ways similar to other aspects of human culture, such as politics, religion, law, and economics. It is also an examination of claims to objectivity, truth, and falsity of propositions and doctrines espoused in the traditions. Swami Vivekananda had complained that philologists tend to focus more on words, their derivation and etymology, reaching out, as it were, for the dictionaries, than seeing them in the context of the larger texts and the holy traditions informing their verse. Vivekananda was adverting to the erstwhile hermeneutical tradition of interpretation used in the tradition and which have a much older history. As Yaroslav Yashilkov in the work on Mahabharata, the oral epic poetry, points out, quote, the scholarship of ancient Indian texts is still in the course of development. To this day, researchers differ on the most crucial questions. So, for example, they're not clear as to whether the Mahabharata was composed with artistic means of folklore or individual poetic creations, unquote, but I would also ask, out of a philosophical dilemma, out of moral dilemmas of philosophical proportions. Those questions are not usually asked about the Mahabharata, but I think they're important. They are, of course, asked in the context of the Bhagavad Gita. But that's just one book of the Mahabharata. So another example of this is on which I will focus in the rest of the report is the Mīmāṃsā principle called the ṣad-liṅga, which has been largely overlooked by Indologists. Francis Clooney in America, a comparative theologian, not a philologist at all, nor does he call himself a Sanskritist, has actually paid much attention to it. I, for myself, have a more philosophical, semiological reading of Mīmāṃsā's overall philosophy of language than Clooney's more theological, textual. Doesn't mean to say that he goes into the text. He means as a text related to ritual. That's how he puts it. So there is some resemblance here to Heidegger's epigraph of the hermeneutical circle and the hermeneutic of being, understanding and language as the house of being, that is the fundamental ontology of existence. It is also profoundly related to jurisprudence in law. Indeed, Mīmāṃsā has been widely used in Indian jurisprudential interpretations. Even the Dharma Shastras acknowledge that. I will explain these principles and move to consider how these also inform the Mīmāṃsā philosophy of language in respect of understanding sentences, vakya. Then, and the very important discourse is how this theory fuels understanding of mantras. What kind of linguistic apparatus are they? Do they have any meaning? Are they vakyas? under which linga do they fall? Not entirely related to the linguistic theory, the last question is in regards to the stages of devatas. What kind of being or existence are they? Of course, one would say deva in vernacular, but the Mīmāṃsākas have always used devata. The same question on the question of apurva, as the apurva is the remote, the adrishtaphala of the performance of yajna. How are we to understand this rather transcendental trope in the absence of transcendence in the Mīmāṃsā? But here also I see a merger of the linguistic and the ontological, of being and text, in a hermeneutical open circle of the onto-atheo logos. So rather than onto-theologos, I say onto-a/theologos, because there is no ultimate theo principle in the Mīmāṃsā. So it's in the atheology, not the same as atheism, perhaps more like agnosticism, but more strongly metaphysical agnosticism. So I begin with a poem that I wrote in a paper that's actually called Being and Text. Again, taking sort of, like Heidegger's sort of Being and Time, or Nietzsche, Sartre's Being and Nothingness. I thought Being and Text would be a very good title for a book on the Mīmāṃsā. So in the beginning was the word, shabda. The word was with meaning, artha. The word was meaning in the sense of shabdi bhavana. Arthi bhavana, shabdi bhavana. And I explained that. The word was meaning. Artha in a very strong sense. Now, of course, it's a play on in the beginning was the word was with God, the word was God. But I say the word was meaning in the Mīmāṃsāka context. And it is this that speaketh. So you can hear Heidegger sort of saying a language that speaks. So the next section is called scholasticism and eisegesis. So eisegesis is a play on exegesis with the iso added in place of the ex there. Now we all acknowledge that it is through the painstaking works of exegetes, so people who do exegetical work, philologists and linguists, from Europe since the 17th century, that much of the impenetrable texts of South Asian and Oriental thought have come to light and have been made accessible to modern philosopher-scholar. Curiously, the European philologists and translators had also to acknowledge, even if they did not take it on board, the kind of exegesis and hermeneutics these traditions had evolved in their sophisticated thinking and in the production of their finely crafted philosophical arguments in the text. I was going to say philological, but I really mean philological arguments. But something else also happened to the text and the careful reading thereof in their hands. There was a particular kind of intervention that their own peculiar exegesis enacted. Now, Andrew Tuck, an American scholar, has called this liminal exercise eisegesis. The claim is that each reading of a text is unavoidably determined by some set of prejudgments or prejudices, notwithstanding the effort to contextualize the reading. Each scholar works within the ambit of the interpretive tradition, the cumulative scholarship, background beliefs, and commitment of the scholarly community at a particular historical moment. In fact, most exegesis of a period in question turn out to be instances of eisegesis, implying that the scholar reads as much of the representative tradition into the text as the text would disclose its own meaning. This methodology has contained to determine certain formations and representations in the development of aspects of South Asian thought as well into the modern, postmodern eras, especially in the comparative East-West reworkings. Ideological, apologetic, and mythological elements foreshadowing and later echoing the company and European, that's the East India Company, and European imperialist agenda became intertwined with deep Orientalism that sought to represent, contain, and appropriate Indian scriptural and philological texts, inclusive of Arabic scholastic falasifa and philosophical texts of other cultures. So the Dutch East India Company involved in appropriating texts from Indonesia, for example. In part, this has resulted in reading current Western paradigms into the text. Previously neo-Hegelian, positivist, empiricist, Eliadist, popular psychoanalysis, or the Bauhausian phenomenon. When it hits the high road of theory, we get a dismissal of traditional methods in passages such as this by the philosopher from Hawaii, Elliot Deutsch. I quote, "The exegetical dimension of Vedanta is of very little interest to Western students of philosophy. We do not accept the authority of the Vedas, right? Or for that matter, the authority of any other scripture. Consequently, we're not concerned whether the system or another best interprets certain obscure passages in it." So he completely dismisses any hermeneutics that might come from within the tradition. And when the cynical gaze turned on the Mīmāṃsā, how this eisegesis did its work. So Mīmāṃsā is a tradition of interpretation, but eisegesis does another interpretation of the tradition and either accepts its interpretive mechanism or dismisses it. So instead of looking closely at the promises the Mīmāṃsā might hold towards a burgeoning interest in hermeneutics, in criticism, rhetoric, jurisprudence, most Indological writers dismiss Mīmāṃsā in just the way Elliot Deutsch remarks about the exegetical excesses of Vedanta intended to marginalize this aspect of early Hindu thought. Of course, by Vedanta, they meant all of them, Mīmāṃsā as well, Sankhya, Vaisheshika. But for Mīmāṃsā, there probably wouldn't have been the logic of Nyaya, a term itself given by the Mīmāṃsā, broadly meaning the line of reasoning. But of course, the line of reasoning in the text or with the text. So not to speak of the richness of Vedanta, which is otherwise also known as Uttara or later Mīmāṃsā. Thus, the Mīmāṃsā did not place the goal of liberation or salvation high on the agenda. The Mīmāṃsā did not place the goal of liberation or salvation high on the agenda, and instead prescribed to a rather heretic view of non-personalist or orthodox origins of the Vedas, the doctrine of Aparushya, prescribed to a rather heretic view might have in a large measure contributed to the disinterest shown by basically otherwise committed Orientalists. The polymorphic, polyandric, pathological perversity of the many-faced gods and voluptuous goddesses and appealing animal gods of popular Hindu tradition, as Max Muller indeed keenly observed, was to be matched only by the dry, arid, abstracted, and lifeless exegesis of the Pandits, preserved in the Spartan stoicism of the Mīmāṃsā, of the Jainists, a sentiment later echoed by a galaxy of Indian philosophers from Radhakrishnan to Bhattacharyas, inclined more towards a kind of an idealist Vedanta. But in recent times, the virtue of Mīmāṃsā are beginning to be seen in somewhat different light, largely due to the work of Pandita K2 Pandurangi, Daya Krishna, both of whom mentored and inspired the present author. And also I should add here, indeed, William Halfast and Francis X. Clooney, who have attempted to draw out certain definite philosophical, theological ramifications of the axiological, ritual exegesis and textual hermeneutics of what is significantly India's most influential exegetical discourse. Their focus was on dharma, and they source the brahmanas, which set out ritual or performative injunctions and their purpose. All such performative or action exhortations might need some rules and guidelines for interpretation and subsequent implementation. A system of rule-governed interpretations was developed, and this literally investigative inquiry came to be known as Mīmāṃsā, as the hermeneutics is derived from the intersection between Hermes, the messenger, and the gods. Moreover, as David Zilberman, a great Russian-American Indologist, in his groundbreaking book, The Birth of Meaning in Hindu Thought, which I believe is translated into Russian, poignantly shows that 1,000 years of Indian reflection on the problem of meaning has produced a diverse and competing array of theories that veer toward the deontic or apodictic modality of subjective significations or conceptual contentness, and not always towards the representational mirroring or unmediated direct reference of the outside world. Without this, the interpretive task of hermeneutic phenomenology, ritual, axiological, scriptural exegesis, and transcendentiality of synctams, of Purva Vachaka, alike would never have got off the ground and successfully applied across to ordinary language, to Laukika discourse as well. It is generally overlooked that despite the intense ritualistic grounding of traditional Mīmāṃsakas, with Kumarila Bhatta, the shift occurs from the ritualistic to the speculative, epistemological and grammatical, and this is achieved with some degree of dialectical acumen. The strongest possible articulation of astikatva position, the astika position, makes no commitment to any transcendental signified, which itself is not erasable. So there might be a transcendental signified, but it's erased. Rather curiously, a good part of the erstwhile defense is based on the postulate of the inseparability of word and its meaning, generally known as the Autpatika thesis. So if there is a timeless nityatva relation, but it need not be eternal, suggesting that the binary is held in tension with the synthetic unity of Shabda and Artha, namely with difference and naturalness. So the idea that word and meaning would be permanent, not necessarily eternal, doesn't have to be, but at least it's permanent. Parthasarathi Mishra reinscribed the relation for ordinary discourse in terms of the pratyaya and pratyayaka, or samajñā and samajñin, that is unsaturated own meaning and saturated designation, which it shares with all naming signs. And while this relation is severable and open to reconfiguration by prevailing conventions, its function is not reducible to a mere denotation or to a reference. Samajñā is itself nuanced towards understanding. It will appear to be closer to and a precursor, if not imported into, the Saussurean thesis of sign, namely the signifier-signified relation, wherein the signified may loop back to another signifier or forward to a transcendental signified. So I use, I should have a diagram, but I'm not going to be using that here. So the transcendental signified would be just the TSD, which may again become another transcendental signifier, TSR. So signifier, signified loops themselves, endlessly, which may again, the link chain of signifiers has no semantic closure. And if mathematical logic and legal propositions can function without reference to the subject's intentionality, then even the Husserlian sin is not of much use, right? So that's so what Derrida had done with signifier from the Saussurean semiotics, and made it sort of endless progression. I say similar thing can be done for a transcendental signified as well. So there's no closure, there's no end, there's no foreclosure. Now, the interlooping or interplaying of the binary pair of word and meaning, whether taken in the Laukika sense or the Alaukika sense, as if in an eternal wedlock, is, I believe, a significant indicator at the same time of the differential or difference, just as it echoes later in the semiological insights pressed upon in the linguistic by Saussure, and through him in the French deconstructive semiologies. What do they go on to establish is the power of words, the Shabda Sakti, through sentence, speech acts, and proper discourse formations to yield a great more meaning than even human intentions could wish itself to convey. Hence, the first step towards the Aparushayatva impersonal meaning construction argument. The self-same Shakti is involved in the Bodha as in the source. It is only because we are able to comprehend sentence meaning that we're also able to generate sentences, but neither necessarily entail that we are the absolute source of origin of sentence, where discourse and speech acts. Perhaps we learned to do this from the Vedas or from language itself. So there's an adage, Vakyatvam astu, aparushayam astu. Likewise, according to the Mīmāṃsā, Vedas says sacred words, mantras and samhitas, reinscribe themselves, rekindle their middle voice, manifest their hidden meanings, both in the act of sacrifice and in the transgressive apurva, the deferred traces. This is how the Veda as language speaks. Now, to sum up this part of the discussion, I'm conscious of time. I'm almost about halfway through the paper. So can I keep going, do you think? Or would you like me to?
Yes, of course, you are free in your time, so you...
Okay, all right. To sum up this part of the discussion, by making the relation between word and meaning relatively permanent, Mīmāṃsakas ascribe to a certain kind of textuality the power to disseminate just those signs and no other. Hence, the contingency of the Samskrita culture paradigm were denied. Or as Quine has also said, in analyzing our language, we use tools that already embed those very things we find in language, such as identity, truth, logical relations, and so on. The processing of the absent or purva gives Vedika word its power. This is its transgression, the ontologization of the latter as the transcendental signified, which too comes under eraser, entrenches the connection of the visible with the invisible, and that tension is an important one. Again, we notice here some resemblance to Heidegger in his ontologization of language in the service of unearthing hidden truths of being. We are born into language, and it is language in its most poetic symbolic form that gives formation to our emergent being. Or paraphrasing Duane Williams, quote, although being is not reducible to language, the disclosure of something as being, and thus standing in being, occurs only by way of language. Language is thus, in Heidegger's famous phrase from his Letters of Humanism, the house of beings, the subreptive crest of non-being or nothingness that bursts forth a dwelling abode in which humans and all things can be. Or in Kalyaspa's terms, language as such is the appearance of the all-embracing consciousness. This reminds one of Bhartrhari, his idea of Shabda Brahman. But I want to not connect Mīmāṃsā and Bhartrhari in this context at all. Heidegger had titled his work On the Way to Language. I think he could have said On the Way to Being, Riding on Language, which would be closer to what the Mīmāṃsakas would say. And I intend to write a book on that. With a more decisive focus on ritual exegesis, Clooney has a succinct description of how the Mīmāṃsā proceeds. Quote, this inquiry in Dharma proceeds by a careful delineation of the connection between ritual events and their textual sources, between texts and their place in ritual enactment. Texts are inherently implicated in the world of ritual practice, and careful reading is the necessary prerequisite to a coherent practice. End quote. He further comments, Mīmāṃsa's careful distinctions and connections are among words and actions. I got distracted, sorry. Mīmāṃsa's careful distinctions and connections among words and actions were articulated through a style of exegesis that proceeded by the composition and scrutiny of specific textual loci, carefully formulated, examined, and argued case studies, adhikaranas. The rhetorical discourse of the Mīmāṃsā is argued out in these case studies according to the complex rules for correct interpretation and debate. Mīmāṃsā guides inquiries into a correct reading and, when needed, into ever more elaborate arguments in defense of that reading. End quote. It's a very, very poignant passage. Now, what is of interest to modern readers, as indeed it is for the founders of the more philosophically appealing schools of Vedanta, despite its rootedness in the Brahmanas, but in the speculative and speculative Upanishads, despite its rootedness, let's say, of Vedanta, not in the Brahmanas, but in the metaphysical Upanishads, was also scholastic systematicity and the exegetical enunciations that could be performed, and performed they must, on a tradition's primary canons, whatever they might be. So in other words, Vedanta takes Mīmāṃsā hermeneutics very seriously. So there is, on the one hand, the performative contextuality, on the other hand, the expanded contextuality. The former has to do with rules intra-text for interpreting and determining the correct course of action, or rather understanding of just what is being signified. The latter is the intertextual tradition of commentaries that may have a more ad hoc role to play, but nevertheless were to be read interactively with the core text, requiring a further set of sophisticated and refined rules for the process. So this is why you have the Upanishad, then you have the Brahma Sutra, then you have the Brahma Sutra Bhashyas and Bhashyas and Virtis and other commentaries on those texts. What this meant for the Vedanta was that the fate of the Upanishad and the doctrine of Brahman was to be ever more completely mediated. Was to be ever more completely mediate. Yes, they were to completely mediate this web of text and tradition. That was the idea. So what we're really saying is that what the Mīmāṃsakas were doing was basically interpreting things within the text of what action is to be led to and what the text says about that action and so forth. You don't go beyond that text. Whereas what the Vedanta is doing is they are looking at one text and another text and another text and another text and text beyond the text to get back to the root meaning, the core meaning, and the significance of the text. So there are two kinds of hermeneutics that are involved here. Pardon me. So I'll say a bit more on the former, the performative context, the intertext. The rules described in the Purva Mīmāṃsā Sutra outline 6 ways of determining the meaning of a text, each less persuasive than the one listed before it. First is, so what is explicitly said, Shruti? What is implied by what is said, Linga? What can be construed from syntactical units such as sentences, Vakya? How 2 parts of a text can be linked as a context to fill out their meaning, Prakarana? What can be estimated based on the proximity or order of ideas in the text, Krama? What can be learned from names analyzed etymologically? Pardon me. Maybe I'll get some water. Some more water. All right. So the first principle, Shruti, is to be resorted to if the meaning of the text is clear and it accords with the intention. But there are texts whose meanings seem to be clear, but to give that literal meaning would totally undermine its intention, right? So difference between the link principle and the Vakya principle may also be noticed. In the former, no violence is done to the wording of a text, but the words or expressions are constituted differently from literal sense. Hence, the link is really construction by context. In Vakya, however, some violence is done to the text, for example, by connecting 2 separate sentences, or by adding words or expressions, or by transferring words or expressions up or down a sentence. The violence may sometimes become necessary to save the text from becoming meaningless or absurd, just as a surgeon may have to do violence to the body by operation to save the patient's life. Okay. So special attention is paid to the linga. I mentioned the ṣad-liṅgas. There are 6 which may be borne in mind when looking for the purport or the signification of the text. Unity, first is unity of the initial and concluding passages, recurrence of the theme, any new conclusion discovered, the general consistency throughout, the recommendation or criticism of specific matters, alleged results. The first one is the upasamhara, the opening and concluding passages of a particular text. They introduce and summarize the subject matter. They provide the context in which the rest of the text is to be understood. They must be in the context and in harmony with each other and thus determine the purport of the body of the text. It is a fallacy to begin with an assertion and then complete the argument with a different conclusion. Abhyasa, the recurrence of the theme. Often the same thing is repeated in a different way in order to impress it upon the mind or to clarify a particular point. The figure of speech in which the theme is represented should not be taken as a new teaching or precept, but must be taken in context with the original injunction. These 2 passages must both be understood as conveying the same meaning. The apurvata, novelty of meaning. Often the text may introduce a new explanation of a dharma concept or a new and expanded development upon the previous dharma theme, or perhaps a different way of conceptualizing the absolute Brahman. Upapati, congruity or consistency of the conclusion in the argument throughout. In order for a text to have any validity, it must be in harmony and agreement with all the relevant factors within the bounds of logic and pragmatism. Arthavada, corroborative statement, commendation or criticism. Phala, alleged result. Often at the end of a hymn, stotra or story, various exaggerated results from the recitation or hearing of the passages. mentioned. Now, Vedanta carried forward the Mīmāṃsā systematics into its own concerns with descriptive metaphysical speculation in the Upanishads and retained each of the major moves with substitution of ontology or rigid descriptions in place of action. The Vedanta exploration following the Upanishadic Socratic wisdom was enriched by exposition, summation, question and answer, thesis and counterexamples, reductios and criticisms. The speculations may have gone far beyond the text, as I said earlier, but the style of exegesis and hermeneutical spirit remained within the confines of the framework settled by the Mīmāṃsā. Of equal significance of the Vedanta performative, if one might put it this way, is a continuous effort in every adhikarana to discover rules or to refine and limit already known rules to deal with a specific problem. The two rules are samanvaya, reconciliation, and upasamhara, overriding, which are specified through the examination of series of contested situations in which the general principles as thus far stated is tested, clarified, expanded, and limited in ever more nuanced bodies of rules, nyayas, and the first and third adhyasa abound in the making and stretching. These rules make room for intertextual borrowings of details of description, even from disparate different schools, such as meditational texts of other schools, and the introduction of qualificative descriptors, even those that have not been explicitly stated in the primary text. The speculative implications of this is that because Brahman is not constituted solely by the text, the Vedanta may make judgments about the use of text that go beyond what the texts state. And so the other principles are also then brought into play here. There is here in this connection a whole section on the mechanics of grasping sentence meaning, padarthas to shabda-artha to vakya-artha, and which are early on were applied to the yujus as the composite expression of vidhi, the ritual sentence, the ritual injunction. And there are differences between the Bhattas and the Prabhakaran schools, with Ambeka Bhatta and Mandana Mishra somewhere in between. Basically, the philosophy is that the basic constituents of language are phonemes, and in succession they produce a composite unit of meaning. The last component, phoneme, along with the expression of each of the preceding ones, bring about the cognition of the meaning of the word. And the individual words, by denoting generals, jati and akriti, compounded with a verb form, give rise to shabda bodha or vakya artha, either by the construction of each individual word meaning, called abhida lakshana sambhava, or the abhihita anvayavada, just abhihita anvaya, or which the Prabhakara school insists on. The whole meaning is comprehended only in the context of the sentence and not in the word. That is, no word can be understood as having independent meaning when it is isolated from the sentence. And that this other one is called Anvita Bhidana. One wing of Heidegger's circle of hermeneutics is implicated here. I think well, this is how it works. Suppose we take the vidhi. Whoever desires swarga should perform sacrifice. This is a well-known example. Without concerning ourselves at this stage with the questions of syntax, we notice here a string of signs which breaks up into signifiers, basically as the ling and dhatu, swarga shabda karaka, which is the neutral in the instrumental case, and the signifieds as the twofold bhavanas or impulses, efficiencies, namely the performative action, and phala, the final one, as swarga. But the phala is not actually observed and is not forthcoming in the sacrifice, for it is deferred or postponed, which means that the two bhavanas in turn become signifiers, portending a third signified, namely the apurva, an unprecedented efficiency, and this is the transcendental signified, the adrishya artha, literally unseen effect or entity. And later on, I'll go into say a little bit more about apurva in this context. Now we come to mantras. What are mantras? What kind of signifiers are they? And what meaning do they have? Finally, applying the above principles, what are we to make of mantras? Are they to be classed as vakya, sentence, having literal purport, or arthabhada, auxiliary purport, or meaningless? It's very important to ask if they're meaningless, because there is an intervention on this score. The recent scholarship on mantras in the Mīmāṃsā is extensive. Fritz Stahl, Dutch-American scholar, following Strauss and Renou, and Daya Krishna, Pattabhiram Shastri, K.D. Pandurangi, and John Tabor, among others, have been engaged in this disputation. I will report on a few of the salient points from this debate in concluding this discussion, and I begin with the Bhattas. For Kumarila Bhatta, mantras appear to have the same grammatical function as the rest of the Vedic sentences, albeit in a more formulaic form or in the context of a ritual. But do they really have any meaning? Do they refer to anything in particular? What meaning does mantra such as this have? Aditi is heaven. Aditi is the atmosphere. Or Agner Vrata. What meaning do this carry? The consensus among the Mīmāṃsakas seem to be that although mantras embed meaning, linguistically speaking, even as part of an elaborate speech act, they belong to the Arthavad, useful or Arthavada category, to wit, auxiliary or subsidiary affectations in the procedure. They have an explanatory role as well in that they register the name place for each samagri, sacrificial ingredients, and their elemental correspondence, plus the significance in the procedure that is largely substantially one of tyaga, giving up, agnehe, swaha. So giving up, tyaga, dana, gifting. For this one may need imaginary. So you could say Atithi Devo Bhava, the God is a guest. So you need to invoke an imagined receiver. Nevertheless, mantras fall outside the sadhana sadhya iti kartavyam matrix. So it's not sadhana of any kind. Hence, according to Shabara, mantras serve to bring to light the subsidiary parts of the sacrifice as it is being performed. End quote. Derived as it is from the root man, to think. Man, to think. Mantra alludes to the bringing to mind the manasa, noesis, with the suffix tra from trana, which suggests releasing the noetic supplication as the ostensive mantric effect. So, because of man, from get mati, man. Recall the as yet unmanifest mantric effect in the apurva, which more properly is the yaga or yagnik effect, as I call it. The mantra then bears a deferred signification rather than a direct indicative signification, and not even a verb. So it's not even it's not connected with action, nor is it connected with any indicative, direct description, drawing on mythologic or symbolic associations in the mind. So it's an association, a metonymy of some kind of an intentional or cognitive ramification. Again, the deities they name or stem the sacrifice with, like Agni, Vayu, Aditi, Indra, are granted pseudo-existence, a momentary effervescence in the wider imaginary of what might pick out the divinities of light, divya. Had the Mīmāṃsā any inkling towards the ontotheos or theism of any variety of persuasion, notwithstanding the later emendations by the converted Uttara Mīmāṃsaka or the Sarveshvara Mīmāṃsā, who are really basically Vaishnavites who took over forms of Mīmāṃsā. So another scholastic Pandit in Varanasi once asked me, what is email login? He asked me about this email that we do. I replied to the effect that what mantras are to the Mīmāṃsakas exactly as you have explained them to me, so mantras are like the login, name, and password we use for logging into the cyberspace internet accounts, the smoky realm. This is why we call them the cloud. They have no role in what we do after, and the directives we might follow once the core messages are downloaded in the inbox or outbox. So this sort of apurva is like a cloud box where our dana, our punya, the karma from the action reside. So giving it yet another spin, Tabor had said that they sort of have illocutionary force. In other words, they're like a speech act that J.L. Austin and later John Searle talked about. I think this is a slightly exaggerated, because I think the mantras, they don't have any epistemic status as such. They don't yield any knowledge, and they're not part of the pramanas or epistemic platforms as such, but they are a subsidiary part of the Shabdi Bhava, the Shabdi Bhavana, which manifests the intentional will of the speaker and the capacity to incite intellectus, that is, a particular noetic imaginary. It is also called pravartana or prarerana. This knownness in the speaker, gnata, also some people might say jnanatva, evokes arthi bhavana in the hearer. So the Shabdi Bhavana in the author, arthi bhavana in the hearer, that is the property of what is to be done, which is also conveyed by the injunctive suffix, and immediately awakens the will to do accordingly in the hearer, and the person who's hearing. So yaga is its karana, instrumental force, and swarga is its bhavya. So if you have a bhavya, you're in a bhavana for swarga, then there is a bhavana, that's the arthi bhavana that you have. But listen to me, I'm saying that there has to be a shabdi bhavana as well. I want you to have the will to do action. So the withheld cumulative invested credit in the person or wherever the performative is intentionally coming from. So the ultimate significance to be conveyed to the speaker is actually the intentionality to perform. So it's a performative intentionality, and that's the final bhavana or the prarerana that has to be created. And mantra has the function of generating this intentionality. And in that regard, they're reflective of Heidegger's adage that language speaks, language precedes speech. So, however, the apurva, coming now to apurva, it is transcendental in a modest sense, and then only in a provisional or operational sense. For its significance is not so much in its being adrishtatva, not seeing, as Varpatin rightly points out, as in being a mysterious result which has nothing before it, or a being without a preceding instance, that is, in its novelty and prior unknownness, and so also in its near empirical givenness, for it retains the phenomenality of the almost certain phala, the certainty of a phala, and further it will erase itself the moment the phala has matured. So it's very interesting that Mīmāṃsā will not allow us to posit any permanent, ongoing, eternal or timeless, transcendental. Yet the only thing that's eternal and transcendental are the word-meaning relations through which the Vedas are eternal. This is an amazing theory that they have. I mean, these people believe in the reality and the truth and the eternality of language, full stop. No other philosophies come close to this, and not even Heidegger. Hence, once again, the phala functions as a signifier for the deferred but now imminent signified, namely swarga, and which too, like the devatas, has no ultimate or absolute ontological status in Mīmāṃsā, being possibly a signifier for an inner state of happiness in another birth, or something to be consumed, and so its self-identity is eroded. And so, and of course, the apurva can be annulled by the wrong step, bhada, in the sacrifice. What is interesting is that the apurva has no sign for it in the expression itself, and so it cannot achieve reference to itself self-reflexively, as happens when I say I. Yet the hidden, the avyakta, unmanifest, the not yet visible, very interesting that all these terms are taken in the Bhagavad Gita and applied to Krishna, a personal deity. But here it's not. It does achieve signification, though at the upper split level, that is, as a pure signified. This interpretation has proceeded, it may be noted, without any reference to the supposed speaker, author of utterance, or the subject's intention, other than that of the hearer. So this is why when people look at the mantra and they say it's meaningless, but that's because they're looking at, not there at a sort of a metonymical level, but they're looking at the literal level and say it's meaningless. But, you know, I mean, Heidegger had to construct lots of weird Germanic terms because he could not find words to say how to unearth certain kinds of truth from text. Nietzsche probably did that too earlier on. So this interpretation has proceeded, it may be noted, without any reference to the supposed speaker or the utterance of the of subject's intention other than that of the hearer. So the intentionality has to be arise in the hearer. And it assumes any attempt to forge a direct, unmediated link between the text and the ritual, or word and action, as though no meaning understanding is involved in hearing words that impel one towards this or the other performance. So I'm reminded here of the Pavlovian, the creation in Russia of the Pavlovian stimulus response thing, that there is a stimulus and there's a response. Doesn't go through the cognition at all. Of course, it got modified when other kinds of behaviorists came in. As of course, there is a cognitive process going on. So that's what I'm bringing my intervention is that between text and ritual, there is a whole cognitive hermeneutic circle. So it's a triangle really, and the apurva is hovering somewhere above that. Now the final few pages, and I'll be done. I'll just touch a little bit on the meaninglessness that Stahl was one of these big defenders of the meaninglessness of mantras, which he compared the mantras to bird songs. Stahl makes a valid observation that mantras are really pre-semantic tropes that nonetheless have a peculiar form in natural language, which is more important than their meaning. The form is based on what phrases are called laws of similarity, which we find in general principles governing Vedic ritual, that there should be one-to-one correspondence, sadrishya, between mantras and rites. Katyayana's Shrota Sutra, for example, defines mantras as Rik, Yajush, Shama, Nigada, which comprises all that is different from the Brahmanas in the Samhitas. In the Mīmāṃsā style notes, mantras are similarly defined and their formal characters and difference from language are similarly stressed. That is, the order of the words, the krama in mantra, is fixed as in Sanskrit within compounds, or in English, and unlike word order in ordinary Sanskrit, which is free. So Saman are mantras, and like the bija mantra of the Tantrism, they may contain meaningless sounds, but their sheer form lends significance to the syntactical structure and function of the rite being enunciated. So that's another way of looking at the meaning. It's not in the semantic field, it's in connection with the whole syntactical structure. So it's another kind of a hermeneutic circle, if you like, without paying attention to the semantics. It is also curiously interesting that Arya Samaji founder Dayanand Saraswati revived the deity-less Havi or Homa, as they call their own orthopraxis based on Vedic Samhitas and mantra. And Dayanand, like the Mīmāṃsā, eschewed the idea of the final irreversible liberation, moksha, recognizing only temporary paradise of the state of bliss, temporary devatās, or what I call effervescent mantric effects, and only accepting swarga as a multi-tiered anandalokas, world of pious works, to the Puranic Devayana or Pitrayana. Right? So it's really the anand that you have here is the swarga. So a final word on apurva. The apurva is the supplement to the divine, being with a capital B. It might even be a dangerous supplement for Hinduism, in that it is like the spuren, traces in the Heideggerian sense of the gods having fled and left only traces in the infinitely extending abyss. And I find it so fascinating that I could find echoes of some of these in Heidegger. But it keeps the Ashwavahana running. That's a joke that I will try and explain perhaps later. So is the transcendental signified. So maybe I could go back and say, it's the joke from Ashwamedha, but I'm saying that the horse is still running in the Mīmāṃsā. It's not caught and quite sacrificed. Because it like Parmenides' chariot, it goes off into the apurva. So is the transcendental signified as a supplementarity. It incorporates and displaces inverse traditional oppositions and unfolds the undecidables. It intertwines the visible and the invisible. It's a very, very important notion. Nobody's paid any attention to Apurva in the Mīmāṃsā. Even Alphas doesn't come close to this. So I was to conclude with a historical observation on the overall project of the demantrification, the de-deification, especially the impersonalization of Vedic sacrifice and its authority in tow in the hands of the Purva Mīmāṃsakas. This would be my reasoning. The reciting, reiterating the Veda in the sacrificial discourse goes on. It goes on even today, as if work all in itself and by itself as modes of textuality inscribing and reinscribing itself. So it's never really stopped. So at what point do we say that we are going to do interpretation of this text? You go back to the tradition and think that's really where the texts are. That's what a lot of Indologists have done. But in fact, it's not. It goes on today. Thus, writing is referred to in the middle voice. It is used intransitively, like lightning, maybe even sacrificing. So in a way, it's about not sacrifices, but about sacrificing. That's a very important concept that I think people like Derrida were able to deal with, the intransitive. Just sacrificing, not what is sacrificed or who is sacrificing or to whom it's being sacrificed. In the Rig Veda there is in the Purushottama, the sacrificing itself, sacrifice. That's all. If the gods came after, they came out of the sacrifice rather than the ones involved, either doing the sacrifice or the recipients of sacrifice. Sacrificing itself by sacrifice. Consider the impending impersonality of the Upanishads, gods replaced by a neuter Brahman, the platform for authorless authority. So in a way it continues. The authorlessness, the impersonalization continues in the Upanishads with the idea of Brahman. Remember in Shankara, it's so completely impersonal that you had to have a Ramanuja come along and say, hang on, wait a minute. We need to bring back a personality into Brahman. And so, he divided it into Nirguna and Saguna in most radical way than Shankara would have cared about. And then some of the Upanishads have that, they have that. In fact, the Chandogya Upanishad recalls there was a tradition where, Brahman and nothingness were the same. How can that be, they say, Ishavasya idam sarvam, that comes along the Isha Upanishad and sort of personalizes that Brahman. So again, the impersonally grounded, hence rituals have to be, in a preponed sense, impersonally serviced. No middle or intermediary agency is permissible, for that is an impossibility in the iteration of the spokenless word. And so it's a spokenless word. There is no person speaking, only hearing. That's why Shruti, the heard word. I would even venture to suggest that the supreme principle of existence is rendered apaurusheya. I'm happy to sort of say with the Mīmāṃsakas that the supreme principle of existence, not talking about, who's the greatest, a greater of which no greater can be conceived and so forth. I would say that for the Mīmāṃsaka, it's apaurusheya. Applying the characteristic of apaurushayatva beyond the concern with language and the preeminence of Shruti as the divinely sacred language of being and non-being. So Shruti, in the sense, is, but it's not just the text of Shruti. I think it's the text, the language, and the ground of that language, which is being, so existence. So if you bring in existence, that's why I call it the supreme principle of existence. Now, Sheldon Pollock, the Sanskritist in Columbia University, argues that the Mīmāṃsaka are on an apologetic track of denying history, the historicality of an uneven temperament and arrangement, such as the caste-based social saturation and the implied exclusion of the Shudra from the performative acts, the Vedic rituals and Sanskrit as the dead language of the gods. And that's the title of the book. Why is there a dead language? Yeah, it's still alive because the rituals are alive, the sacrifices are alive. It is going on. Even the writing is going on, if not the speaking of the text, in a sense. And so it's the implied exclusion of the Shudra from the performative acts, and of the women too, to a large extent. as Teva rightly points out, the Mīmāṃsā probably evolved at a time when the traditional sacrifice law was becoming less known. That's debatable. I would add a corollary to that. We have to look ahead, not to history, but the future to be from the moment a little before the classical philosophical turn in India, with Buddhism and Jainism increasingly competing with the Vedic ritualism, with their own pre-corona version of an impersonal karma doing theory. So, they had a competition from another impersonal theology, if you like, of Buddhism and Jainism. And so there was no reason for them to become suddenly proponents of Purushottama theology. So it is about denying Purushottama of all possible authority and the procedure and the results there too. No decent secular constitution puts the heavens or gods or God above its authority, except in Pakistan and other theocratic nation states in the Middle East, maybe Indonesia. No, I take back, not Indonesia. This adage might serve as a heuristic here, for again it is the Mīmāṃsāka's rule of interpretation, the veritable hermeneutics that becomes the basis of interpreted rules for the Shrota Shastras, and especially the Dharma Shastras, in meta-shastric and secular to the boot. That's why it's very important for jurisprudence. It survived the colonial legalistic structuring and continues to be invoked and utilized in juridical matters in the Indian courts to this day. That's a legacy not to be forgotten. I like to change the epithet of Purva Mīmāṃsā to Apurva Mīmāṃsā. Nothing like this hermeneutics before or after. So the school that I would enunciate if I were a Mīmāṃsaka, which I'm not actually, I'm more a Nyayaka, would be Apurva Mīmāṃsā. So that's the end of my report. Over to you, Professor Rosanna.
Hello. Yes. I think that you have about probably 15 minutes. It's okay.
I'm happy to spend another 20 minutes.
Okay. So I was reflected on your position as an Nayaic. Okay. Thank you very much. It was a very brilliant lecture. And any comments or questions? Дорогие коллеги, прежде чем задавать вопросы, комментарии, я прошу вас включить камеру и представляться.
Prashna. The Russian word prashna.
It's a Russian word. I'm just asking my colleagues just to open their face when they are talking and so introduce themselves. Пожалуйста, who wants to start? I can't start if nobody wants. Just Наталья Алексеевна. Okay, I will start. Thank you very much. So my question is, and my probably comments, I think my colleague will support me then after my comments. So it is commonplace for the classical Indian philosophy that it presupposes the strong linguistic knowledge. So if you take any treatise which is supposed to be a philosophical one, you will find there discussions concerning the linguistic problematics, which in some places could be hidden, but nevertheless they exist. For the European tradition, this dominant linguistic element is something facultative, additional to the basic metaphysical problematics or ontology, etc. And sometimes there is two temptations in the study of the Indian philosophy. The first one is to reduce a text or a system to the linguistic level, or to fill the space of study with descriptions and realia and multitude references, etc. And we can see such a trend in the modern Indological studies. So there is a huge and deep concentration on the terms, text, etc., supported by something or a type of fear of some philosophical generalizations. The last one, I mean, philosophical generalization or speculation, you know, involving your very deep knowledge into the sphere of philosophy. Of course, it must be based on the qualified knowledge of the Indian philosophy. But as we see, it is a rather rare case, I mean, among the scholars. And one of the scholars who does it rather masterly is Gerhard Oberhammer. He uses the material of Indian philosophy and transforms it into the very deep philosophical speculations or ideas, and you read it and feel that you go further, you go beyond the just material, just this speculation or discussion of linguistic problems or metaphysical. So you have to philosophize with him just to understand him. And my question is there any attempt to overcome this descriptive philological dominance in the field of the philosophical Indology? And I'm emphasize here the definition philosophical, because otherwise there is a danger to lose the philosophical understanding of the very deep philosophical achievements and ideas of the Indian culture, and we lose the possibility to create the common space for the mutual understanding, at least of two philosophical cultures, Indian and European. And probably we need a new methodological approach for study of Indian philosophy in comparison with the leading philosophical tradition of Eurasia. That's my question.
I'm not sure I followed. I followed the description, but then the question was run through very fast. Is there a descriptive philological understanding, loose possibility, India and Europe and Russia? I took up that.
Yes. Is there any methodological elaborations or elaboration of methodology to involve very strong philosophical elements of the scholar who deals with the Indian philosophy? So we can see now, if we take some articles, published in very high level journals and magazines, etc., it's full of realia. I mean, so references, many texts, and they show the very deep erudition or knowledge, etc. Some informations you never find by yourself. But it's rather difficult to generalize it in a philosophical space. I mean, we see that most of the authors, they even don't try to generalize or to make this material or to transform it into this sphere of philosophy. So to philosophize on among or with the philosophers they study, something like that. And my idea is that probably we need a new methodological approach or apparatus to just and we will take into consideration the achievements of Arabic tradition, European tradition, and the problem of translation of basic notions needs some universal approach, which it's not, just simple, like it was in the past European, when the European scholars try to, to understand the Indian philosophy, they just put their terms, they just use their approaches without consideration some features of Indian philosophy. But the problem is that if Indian philosophy and scholars, so they will concentrate onto the Indian heritage, and they will not try to go beyond this. So at least to go to the philosophical sphere. There is a danger that we lose the possibility to have dialogue, philosophical dialogue, philosophical understanding. It's very important, linguistics and reality and references, and this huge information. But I think that philosophical Indology must go further. So that's my idea.
Right.
Probably there is any attempt already. So among our colleagues.
Yeah. Well, let me just address that very briefly. So one response that I would make is, we're looking for sort of methodologies and so forth in the way that philosophers of science were asking, about science. So, Karl Popper, for example, comes along and says to the science, well, what is your methodology? And unless you have a methodology, there can't be progress in science. And the scientists sort of shrugged and said, oh, we don't know. We just do science. We go into our laboratory and we do our observations and we make hypotheses and we prove and disprove and so forth. And of course, the whole sort of philosophy of science eventually fell apart because no scientist would take them seriously. But it didn't stop science. And the same way, in study of religion, people say, well, we don't have a methodology and so on. We have to have methodology. And they came up with all these methodologies for religious studies, none of which was sort of really viable, but it didn't stop religion from going on. It didn't die. So, I sometimes sort of think, well, there's a lot of methodology in the way Indian philosophers themselves in the classical tradition went about it. Otherwise they wouldn't have had a succession of teachers and texts and schools sort of develop. You just see the debates that went on between the Jains, the Buddhists, and the other Brahminical, we might just call them all Indian philosophers, really. The Vad Vivad, that is really one of the great keys, and they had set up a dialogic method, but they also set up more confrontational methods as well. I mean, the Buddhists and the Nyayakas were not in dialogue; they were actually in contestation most of the time, even to the point of having physical fights. The fight between Kumarila Bhatta and Dharmakirti is pretty well recorded. It's sort of. I'm not suggesting that we build that into our methodology, although Wittgenstein and Karl Popper almost had a physical blow with each other. But there is a traditional methodology that we need to go back and look at and see how did these people do Indian philosophy. It's as though I think the Europeans come in and sort of say, well, there are these dry, arid texts and so forth. We want to find out what are they speculating about. We need to develop a methodology so that we can understand that philosophy. But as you say of Gerhard Oberheimer, that we need to philosophize with him. Well, I think that similarly we need to philosophize with the classical texts because they are they were philosophizing in their own right. It's just that when they become texts, it looks like they've stopped philosophizing. I mean, this is one of the things that text does. Text fossilizes. It becomes a kind of like a museum piece, and it seems to put a closer to the discussions that were going on. And one of the things that I think postmodernists have done, at least, is to take that judgment on text out of it and say, the text is still speaking to us, and they should write through us rather than rewrite the text. And that's a very important thing that I think we need to understand, or the kind of Spinozian kind of hermeneutics that the text must go, interpretation must reflect much more on what we're doing, what we are, but also perhaps teach us something. We don't want to learn from the text. We don't want to learn how to philosophize the ideas. And one of the sort of things that happen and is happening, continues to happen. Some of the journals called, Journal of Indian Philosophy, are not doing that kind of philosophy. And I think you point to that there's a lot of textual references and so and so. Very recently, I was publishing Journal of Indian Philosophy from the time of Motilal. He's one of the most successful publishers in the journal, but he's recently sort of really taken over more by philologists and people. So I submitted the paper which was on Radhakrishnan, and they said, the reviewer came back and said, it's not enough textual material in there. I thought, this is crazy. Radhakrishnan is not producing any kind of new text. He is commenting on text, and I'm commenting on the way he went about commenting on text. And I've referenced everything that Radhakrishnan ever wrote in regard to that particular problem. So it was pretty clear that they have a bias towards, what are sort of already pre-modern classical type text. And that's the only thing that they are interested in. And I thought, well, this is very interesting. I'm trying to philosophize, through Radhakrishnan into sort of contemporary context and so on, and they're not interested in that. I think in a way, Halfas was onto something. He was saying, we need a hermeneutics of some kind, and we need to, bring the pundits and the texts into dialogue with Western philosophers. So in a way, it wasn't to wake up Western philosophy; it was to wake up the text. And I, completely give him credit for that, for doing that. But he did not quite show in his own understanding how that methodology could actually work. He made pleas towards that, but he didn't show how it would work. I think Motilal comes probably closer to that, because he's very aware that he's working with classical texts, and he also is a representative because he comes from the Pandita tradition himself. Had he stayed on in India in his presidency college, he would have been writing, another Vartika on some part of, Gangesha or Srimani, Raghunath Srimani's text, and we would never know about it because it would be written in Maithila Sanskrit form, and it would just stay there until 100 years later somebody discovers it and then decides to translate it. So he was constantly in dialogue with Western philosophers, with Strawson and Dummett and Quine, with whom he studied, and so on. But he did not articulate a methodology, and I'm trying to sort of unearth that in his work. But he certainly did take problems and deal with them. I think if we are going to be involving Indian philosophy in sort of context with Western, European, maybe I think now Russian, then we certainly need a methodology, and we need to work on that. Finally, one suggestion that comes from Raymond Panikar, which I think is quite interesting, and even the name is very interesting. He calls it imperative, not comparative, not imperative, imperative, from Latin imperare, confront. So one translation of this would be a little more confrontational rather than a gentlemanly dialogue or gentle-personly dialogue. People sitting and having a cup of tea and saying, what does your tradition think? That was a mistake Heidegger had made. I mean, he wasn't really dialoguing with the Japanese. It was just a cup of tea, or chat. There should have been much more confrontation. He never accepted that confrontational thing with Oriental philosophy in the way he did with Greek philosophy, or with his predecessors, Hegel and so on. So that would be very, very interesting. This sort of what Dharakrishna actually called it. He called it counter philosophy. Counter meaning encountering, but also presenting a counter position and then seeing what kind of response you get and then coming to a new understanding about the problematic at hand. So there are sort of disparate attempts here and there, but there isn't a consolidated methodological foundation of that kind. And that's a great, I think it's a great tragedy that we don't have that. And it would be very nice if we had one, then we can apply. But, you know, we're also creatures of history, and we are victims of history. So where we are in a historical position. How can we get out of that historical position to actually get to an Archimedean platform where we could actually say, you know, we're above this historical position. Now we have a foundational methodology which can be sort of universally applied. So we have to be critical. You know, we have to be critical of our own possibilities. You know, whatever we create is still going to be within a historicized context, right? So I'd love to hear responses from our group.
Thank you very much. We touch very painful points, and I'm sure that
Я, наверное, скажу, да?
we'll continue in future. And please, Professor Vladimir Shokhin, the head of Department of Theology of Institute of Philosophy, Russian Academy of Science.
Well, thank you, Professor, for your delightful paper. Especially the Mīmāṃsā system is scarcely known in Russia as compared with some other main philosophical tradition. Nevertheless, we are aware that Mīmāṃsā's contribution into Indian and I believe also into cultural philosophy has been great. It is well known that the Mīmāṃsākas have enunciated the very scheme of Indian method of philosophizing. We were talking about methodology. By differing three steps of analytic discourse. That is a statement of an opponent, answer from an proponent, and thereafter the conclusive statement of a doctrine. Now, Komarila presented what is called epistemological foundationalism today, by emphasis on self-evident truths and correspondingly preventing regressus ad infinitum in argumentation. As to Purvaphala you were talking about, which has to do with the theory of potential spiritual energy, it is again an important contribution this time into the topic of causality. My question is very simple. How would you regard the interrelation of such concepts as Shakti, Apurva, and Adrishta? It is clear they are not synonyms, but how would you build their hierarchy? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I applaud, really grateful for the observations that you make. I didn't know, I would have thought that, you know, just going by the wonderful insights of Zilberman, that Mīmāṃsā has been studied in Russia, but I'd be interested to find out a bit more. You certainly have a good grasp, I can see, of Mīmāṃsā here. But coming to your question, the Apurva, I'm not quite sure that I would go along with quite the definition that you gave of spiritual energy. I'm not quite sure what's spiritual about it. It's much more pretty straightforward, a very formulaic thing in the thinking. That it is really, you know, I mean, I would sort of say almost like an Aristotelian kind of a causal theory of potentia and actualia. That this is there are actually potentiality set up, and it could be energetic. I'm not denying that it could not be a kind of an energetic. It's not a linear causality as such, because I think they envisage when a sacrifice is done, when a yajna is performed, the apurva is the apurva is the sort of immediately second layer of causality. So the ghee and the ingredients that you put in the fire creates the smoke. But right at the same time, there is another non-Euclidean, non-Newtonian causality, which is operating at a different level, and it could be going inside, it could be going outside, and the Hermes, the transmitter are the devatas, through the mantra. So I've never seen the word Shakti used in the context of apurva. The Mīmāṃsākas are very pedestrian, very mundane, very down to earth. The only time they've used Shakti is with Shabda. So Shabda has Shakti to evoke Artha, the meaning, because there is a combination and you need Shakti to bring out the Artha. That's the only way I have seen. I've not seen them talk of apurva as having Shakti, or what was the last? Shakti, apurva, and I can't read my own writing. Adrishta. Well, certainly it's adrishta, yes. It's not visible, it's unseen. So that's why I've translated it as unseen potentia. That's about as much as I would say. The effects that are being produced are not yogic or not spiritual. It's not leading to moksha or enlightenment. It's swarga, but swarga is just an ananda state. If the yajna produces 10 cows, which is the bhavana with which, and I suppose I'm the yajaman, I'm the one who sponsored a sacrifice. I desire, the word swarga is used, but it's not means heaven. The reason why you do a sacrifice is because it's either they are nitya vidhi, they are compulsory, or you do it prudentially. So today is the new moon here, and so you have to do certain sacrifice, and apurva will happen. But there are some that you have distinct kalpana, bhavana. So I want 10 cows, I perform a sacrifice, I organize a sacrifice, and I get it performed, and apurva will result. And once the 10 cows are born, that is swarga. That is the swarga. That's all. But in the process, it's adrishta. When you've done the sacrifice, it remains adrishta. It's not seen. I guess you could read Shakti into it to say, well, it's the Shakti is the potentia, right? It's the potentia. It remains at a potential level. As and when the conditions are right, it will actualize itself. So the adrishta will become drishta. But I wouldn't set up a hierarchy. I don't think, even if I were to say Shakti is equivalent to the potentia, apurva is the overall trope terminology for that. So you would have Shakti, adrishta, Shakti adrishta, and the whole thing is apurva. And you remember I talked about the transcendental signified. That is the transcendental signified. And it is metonomically above, but it need not be. It could be below. It could be on the side. I think sequentially it's different. So they happen in stages. Vidhi, bhavana, arthi bhavana, shabda bhavana, yagna, devatā, mantra, devatā, and then the adrishta, and then the apurva, and then the phala. So I think there is more. I would like to see it as a half moon, if you like, starting here with Shruti, ending up here with the phala, but the level is the same. It's All right. I think the professor has gone out.
He's hearing. He's here.
So,
Don't worry.
Наталья Алексеевна, хотите выступить?
I have one question.
Только сначала представьтесь, пожалуйста.
Of course. Dear Professor Bilimoria, I am Natalia Kanayeva, Assistant Professor from National Research University, High School of Economics. Thank you very much for your coming here and for conversation on Indian philosophy. It was rather interesting. We have heard about the whole history of philosophy, Western and Indian. It was interesting. And I have one small or short question. Did I understand right that Mīmāṃsākas was house thinkers who inspired the idea of impermanent absolute in Upanishads? My question is over, but did you hear me? Rosanna, it seems to me that it's the problem with the connection.
Да, Наталья Алексеевна, вы сразили наповал нашего гостя.
Да, он вырубил и камеру, и микрофон.
Сейчас подождем немножко. Пока можно обсудить какие-то вещи, если вдруг... А вот, пожалуйста.
Did you hear my question?
No, I didn't. We were all muted for a while. This is not as efficient as Zoom. There's some sound. Somebody's phone.
I may write in chat.
You write the question on chat?
Yes.
I think people should turn their cell phones off because they're interfering.
Наталья Алексеевна, попробуйте отключить микрофон. Или мобильный подальше.
So if you could say your question again, please.
I think that this problem with the professor probably your result. Yes, if you understand the reply.
I wonder where is that sound coming from? Is it coming from highway?
Dear Professor, could you enter again? Just leave and enter again. I suppose it's a problem with connection. It is just to try, because I see everybody is with the microphone doesn't work, just only yours. Please, could you leave and enter again?
Так. Дамы и господа, пока, конечно, девица недостатком связи с другой половиной шара. Ну, я, во-первых, скажу, что, конечно, поскольку его выступление длинное, содержательное, в чужеземном языке, то с нашей стороны, наверное, будет правильно за плохой переводимости и непереводимости с философских текстов на русский язык. Поскольку осталось сейчас-то мало времени, он еще выйдет на связь, представить себя интеллектуально и объяснить некоторые своего подхода, в том числе методологического, ну и немножко отозваться об отдельных пунктах, в частности, как-то планировать или добавить к тому, что он говорил о лингвистике мантр со своей стороны. Ну вот примерно так я буду говорить, но тема моя, соответственно, будет о непереводимости, что связано с устройством знаков, то есть языковых, передающих мысли индийские, большей терминологичностью. А самое первое, что я постараюсь уже для вас подробно, это с тем, что индийская и европейская философия развились в взаимно различных схемах рациональности, соответственно, западную средиземноморскую цивилизацию и южноазиатскую цивилизацию. И, в частности, европейская цивилизация стоит на логосе и праксиса, а индийская цивилизация стоит на сваличитте и артхи. Ну, примерно. Так. Коллеги, кажется, у меня не работал микрофон. Работал. Работал или нет? Какие-то значки тут ввели.
Ну вот профессор дописал. Что вот он пытается войти. Может быть, пока какие-то вопросы, комментарии, у кого-то предложения.
Ага. Розанна, хотелось бы знать, какой формат времени определен для круглого стола, потому что связь так плохо работает, что как-то...
Ну, в принципе, я предупреждала его, что у нас обычно длится 3 часа, там выступление где-то 40 минут, час и все остальное. У нас, как правило, обсуждение. Вот. Но он сказал, что ему это слишком, как говорится, too much, и он как раз хотел выступить, обсудить и в 2 часа все уложить.
Угу.
Но я думаю, что это не первый наш семинар с ним, Наталья Алексеевна. Жалко, что Виктория Георгиевна не отреагировала на мое приглашение.
Ну, на самом деле, сразу заметны проблемы, которые имеют место в диалоге европейской и индийской философии. Индийцы очень любят начинать от сотворения мира. Что он сделал? Он представил вообще все. А зачем? Это очень похоже на самооправдание, чем часто занимаются философы индийские и западные. То есть индийцы себя в глазах европейцев оправдывают. Вот Щербацкой себя...
Но пройдитесь по этим спискам, наверняка будут какие-то...
Щербацкой себя оправдывал перед профессиональными философами. Ну, наверное, не стоит так много.
Ну, вот я говорю, нет, у нас смежные темы,
Да.
показать, что там об этом нет.
Может быть, есть смысл конкретизировать
Вот,
какие-то
ну ладно, я ухожу
проблемы
снова в эту конференцию.
и готовить сообщение по ним. Потому что
Хорошо.
и ему тоже было
Ага.
выступать тяжело, когда нужно все это в голове держать.
Ну да, он молодец. Мне кажется, он подключился. Владимир Кириллович, у вас звук подключен. Ага. По-моему, вот профессор подключился. Dear professor, are you here? Так, ну если как бы вот он пока молчит, да, может быть, имеет смысл тогда завершить, как вы полагаете? Я думаю, что основные, вот и самое главное, знакомство произошло.
Да.
Мы планируем 24 февраля, ну, примерно, да, это ориентировочная дата, провести семинар по мани-провалам. Будет выступать Николай Валентинович Гордейчук. Это тоже будет индийская философия, собственно говоря, да, поэтому, коллеги, пожалуйста, присоединяйтесь. Вот, и дальше уже потом я сообщу. Но вот в плане пригласить наших иранских коллег, возможно, семинар тоже будет на английском языке. То есть вот такая практика с международный такой уровень. Я надеюсь, что нам удастся продержаться, да, вот, поэтому вот, если вопросов нет, комментариев, пожеланий, благословений, то можно уже, наверное, завершить тогда.
Ну, Рузан, пожелания, ну, по крайней мере, по индийской части, потому что вряд ли по мусульманской части я буду ходить на эти семинары, работы много. Пожелания по индийской части, как-то более конкретно выступления строить, чтобы нам это было интересно, потому что какие-то вещи, которые он озвучивал, мы, в общем, знаем, помним, и тратить на них время жалко.
Ну да, но он просто, как вот он мне объяснил, он не в курсе был вообще российской индологии, она у него представлена была именами почему-то, философская индология, вот, представлена всего двумя именами, это Ярослав Владимирович Васильков и Виктория Георгиевна.
Да, но только он как американский индолог его привлек, я думаю.
Да, как американского, безусловно. Вот, поэтому вот я думаю, что вот эти все вещи общие, ну, как бы известные, были связаны с тем, что пока аудитория российской индологии ему мало знакома. Поэтому, ну, я думаю, что вот наши комментарии должны как-то были все наладить в этом отношении. Хорошо, тогда давайте тогда завершим, чтобы не задерживать никого. Я напишу профессору о том, ну, благодарности, безусловно, вопросы.
Да.
Вот, Наталья Алексеевна, можете прислать мне вопрос, я пишу.
Он в чате, да, я хорошо на почту прислать, да?
Да, пришлите, пожалуйста, я вам потом перешлю ответ.
Хорошо, да.
Сотрудничать все. Вот. Владимир Кириллович, огромное спасибо за участие. Вот, за всем спасибо большое. Наталья Алексеевна, вот я вижу, там была Евгения Алексеевна тоже отключилась, правда, пораньше, но...
Вот, но все-таки, вы знаете, Рузанна Владимировна, ну, все-таки какой-то регламент должен быть на будущее, потому что вот так вот это сложно. Не остается времени для комментариев. Ну.
Да, и тут еще в связи время, разница во времени в Австралии.
Ну да.
Фактически. Вот, но мы будем это учитывать, дорогу осилит идущий, все эти недочеты, я думаю,
да, конечно.
Как-то скорректируются. Хорошо, ну еще раз благодарю всех.
Да, с почином вас, да, с почином такого большого дела.
Да.
Спасибо.
Всего доброго. До свидания.
Всем успехов и удачи.
Спасибо.